Hi, this is Emerald, and this is part one to the free 2-hour shadow work workshop. And this is actually a re-record of the very first part of the workshop. For about the first 30 minutes, I had forgotten to record, and so I'm just re-recording the first part. So I have some slides on a PowerPoint to share, and then 30, basically like the last hour and a half of the workshop is recorded, and that will have all of the participants on Zoom, and so you get to hear me answer questions and everything from them. But I'm going to go ahead and I'll go through the very first part of the PowerPoint with you. In this part of the PowerPoint, we'll be talking about what the shadow is, like what are shadow aspects and how to name and identify them. And so let me go ahead and I will share my screen. Okay. Alrighty. Okay. All right. So 2-hour shadow work workshop, and I titled it Asking Powerful Questions to Explore Your Shadow Aspects. And so basically, this part of the video will be an explanation of the shadow and shadow work in general, and how to name and identify your shadow aspects, as well as an exercise that I'll have you guys do for naming and identifying your shadow aspects. And then the second video will have the break, and so we won't have that on, but like then we'll be doing asking powerful questions, and so we'll be talking about how to explore your shadow aspects that you've pinpointed in this part of the video, by basically asking questions and kind of getting a deeper awareness of what those aspects are feeling, and what's going on with them in general. Um, and then basically there'll be a brief mention of the shadow work group class, and then basically the Q&A. Well, that was like the last 30 minutes of the workshop. So in this particular section of the video, we're just going to be focused on sections 1 and 2 here. Okay. So let's talk about what the shadow is. So oftentimes we think about the shadow as being some kind of dark and mysterious other that exists in the psyche. And we'll oftentimes get depictions of the shadow as like this kind of like sinister figure, right? But ultimately, what the shadow is the shadow is more like a place. It's sort of a container within the psyche where we put aspects of ourself that we are either unwilling or unable to hold space for at a given time. And so basically, with these aspects, they kind of get pushed into the shadow, and that's what makes them shadowy. But it's not that these aspects are inherently shadowy in and of themselves. So there's nothing particularly about these aspects that make them inherently in the shadow. And basically, these parts that get pushed off into the shadow, they have their own positive traits, they have potential negative traits that come up. And so when we go to integrate these aspects, it's not like we're trying to integrate their negative expressions. So if I have an aspect of myself that's a shadow aspect, and the way that it behaves is that it wants to express anger all the time, and it's maybe super destructive to my relationships, well, that's not the thing that I'm ultimately trying to integrate. I'm trying to integrate the aspect that actually has the vulnerability that leads to that. So what we want to do when we go to integrate the shadow is we want to be working through these coping mechanisms that come up, and kind of seeing what's there at the deepest parts of it. We want to really be tapping into the vulnerability there. And our shadow aspects are not so much like this dark mysterious other. They're a lot like little vulnerable inner children that we want to be pulling back into the fold of our conscious personality. And so we'll call these aspects the personality shadow aspects. And so basically, shadow aspects are aspects that reside in the shadow and act autonomously from the conscious personality. What that means is that the conscious personality might have its own wants, needs, fears, wisdom, and perspective and memories. It might have its own agenda and goals. Whereas these shadow aspects, they might each have their own wants, needs, fears, wisdom, perspectives, and memories that might work in opposition to our conscious goals. And so I like to think about the shadow as being like being in a vehicle that has many steering wheels, but most of the steering wheels are hidden. So if you can imagine that you're trying to drive a car and you feel like you have the only steering wheel that there is, and yet there's 10 shadow aspects in the trunk, and each one of them have their own personal steering wheel. And while you're trying to go left, they're trying to go right and straight forward, and they're trying to go in reverse and all these different directions. And so whenever we have shadow aspects that are working autonomously in this way, it can create a lot of inner turmoil and a lot of agenda clashes. And so, what we want to do with shadow work is we want to be able to become conscious of these aspects that have been pushed into the shadow and bring them back into integration with the conscious personality. And through doing that, we can sort of resolve any blocks that we might have toward moving in the directions we want to move in. And then we also get to experience the sense of wholeness that comes from integration. And one of the things to be aware of with regard to shadow aspects is that when they are cast into the shadow, they kind of stay in a state of arrested development. And so that means if a shadow aspect was repressed at age 5, it's going to stay as you were at age 5 and it's going to be stuck in the same moment. So let's say that there was some kind of situation that was really traumatic. Let's say that at age 5 I experienced my parents arguing and I got really scared and this created a trauma. That 5-year-old aspect, if I don't resolve that, part of me is gonna split off from my conscious awareness, and it's gonna be stuck in that moment of like, "Oh no, mom and dad are fighting. Oh no, mom and dad are fighting." And it's gonna be going around and around and around and around. And until I go and I face with that aspect and I discover it, and sort of question it down to its roots, then I won't necessarily be able to integrate it. So one of the things that's important to recognize about the shadow is sort of like a freezer in a way. It keeps things as it was. And so we can think of the shadow as a place where no information gets in and no information comes out. So basically, let's say that you, as a conscious personality, you've done a lot of work on yourself and you've done a lot of like self growth and you've cultivated a lot of positive and healthy mindsets and all these other kind of things. But let's say that there's an aspect that's 7 years old that's stuck down in the shadow. Ultimately, it's still going to have the same mindsets, the same developmental stage, the same concerns as you as a 7 year old. And so while the rest of your personality is basically behaving in accordance with like healthy adult roles and things like that you've learned, this aspect is going to be having kind of a tug over your personality toward those more rudimentary, like childlike ways of acting, or toward whatever that child believed about the world. So let's say that you consciously believe that you're lovable and that you'll be accepted, but let's say the inner 6-year-old feels like, oh no, I'm going to be abandoned by everyone. That's going to have a pull over the personality. So these shadow aspects can't learn the things that the conscious personality learns until they become conscious. And so that's when we can get these aspects syncing up with the rest of the personality. Until then, they'll kind of stay in that state of arrested development. One of the things that's also an issue here is that the conscious personality loses sight of the strengths and the wisdom of the aspects that are cast into the shadow. So, aspects in the shadow are really, just as much us as any other aspect. And so they can basically hold any kind of parts of ourselves that are, our positive qualities, all of these, different things that we might not necessarily be able to bring to the table if these aspects stay in the shadow. And so basically, in order for aspects to grow and to move past that moment that they're stuck in, they have to be brought up out of the shadow. And so the goal of shadow work here is to basically bring aspects up out of the shadow and integrate them back into the conscious awareness so that we're aware fully of what's going on with them. And so basically the first step toward integrating your shadow aspects is to name and identify them. And so this can be a little bit tricky to name and identify your shadow aspects, basically, because if you're not aware that it's there, how can you name it? Like, so the analogy that I would give is let's imagine that there is a big room, and let's say that someone takes a chair out of the room. And let's say that a day later you stumble upon this room and you go in there and someone asks you what's missing from the room. You're probably not going to be able to tell them the chair because you didn't know the chair was there in the first place. And so this is a bit of the obstacle of shadow work is basically the shadow by its very definition is something that's unconscious to us. And because the shadow is unconscious to us, we might just be inherently unaware of its presence in the first place. And so how can you tell that something is missing or something is repressed when you didn't know it was there in the first place? Um, and if we were conscious of it, it would no longer technically be in the shadow because the shadow is unconscious by its definition. And the shadow and aspects of ourself that reside there are effectively invisible to us because they're underneath the surface of consciousness. And so I have a way to become aware of shadow aspects, and it's to look at its expressions and symptoms. Though the shadow aspect might be invisible to us or unconscious to us, we can see little behaviors, little symptoms, little emotions that might pop up above the surface of consciousness, where we can go, oh, that's a sign of a shadow aspect coming up. Let me focus on that. And so I like to think about it a lot like a root vegetable. So I'm going to show you like this picture. And so we have all these different root vegetables here. And so let's look at the carrot, right? So let's say that the shadow is like the carrot itself, the orange part of the carrot, the actual root. And let's say maybe the deepest root is even this like little tiny strand that like hangs down below the carrot, the very root part of it. But what's above the surface is we have some leaves poking up. And so you don't necessarily have to see the carrot underground to know that the carrot is there because the leaves indicate it's there. And so the leaves in this metaphor are the symptoms, the conscious symptoms that we have of the shadow. And so oftentimes these can be things like people pleasing. So if I notice myself people pleasing and people pleasing is not something that I want to do, I might go, maybe that could connect to a deeper shadow. And so I might name that aspect people pleasing emerald. Or if I notice myself constantly going through a cycle where I feel really, really anxious in my relationship, that could be relationship anxiety emerald. And that could be what the leaves are. Or let's say if I find myself feeling feelings of emptiness often, so maybe that could be like empty emerald or futility emerald. And so basically these things that we become aware of, these symptoms that are going on in our lives, we can name out a shadow aspect for them, and we can start to explore them deeper and deeper to their roots until we can actually understand what's at the deepest root of the root vegetable, that is the shadow. And so basically, if I discover people pleasing, for example, and that's the leaves, and it's like, okay, I have people pleasing aspects. So people pleasing emerald. And it's like, well, why might I be people pleasing? It's like, well, maybe I'm trying to avoid conflict. And so that brings me down a little bit deeper. And I can go, well, why would conflict be so bad? And it's like, well, if I have conflict, then I'm afraid that I'm going to be judged in some kind of way. And so that gets me down deeper. It's like, okay, why would it be so bad to be judged? And it's like, oh, well, then I'm going to feel like I don't belong. And it's like, oh, what would be so bad about that? And like, just kind of going down deeper and deeper until you really hit the root of what's going on. And through doing this, we can start to understand more and more and more about our shadow aspects. And so we want to notice the symptoms and then to explore those symptoms down to their roots. So the question here of how to identify a shadow aspect. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into some general ways to identify your shadow aspects, and then I'm going to give you a list of common shadow aspects. So basically, how to identify a shadow aspect. So you want to identify a shadow aspect by its symptoms, which again are the leaves in that metaphor. And so some of the symptoms can be the following. So agendas, which means that's the goal of a particular aspect of yourself. So for example, if you find yourself trying to impress others, that's a goal. And so you might say, oh, maybe for me, that would be like show off emerald or impressing people emerald. Or let's say if I have, let's say a goal toward, I guess I could even look at a goal toward achievement, so sometimes even positive goals like that can be linked down to some shadow motivations as well as other positive motivations. So let's say that achievement is something that I'm like geared toward, and maybe I find myself even overworking, so if I have this achievement goal, then I might go, okay, well, let's say this is achiever emerald, and I might ask like, well, why is that important? And what if I weren't doing that? I can start to ask questions deeper as I've labeled out that achiever aspect. Then I have behaviors and coping mechanisms. So coping mechanisms are a subset of behaviors. Behaviors are basically just anything that we find ourselves typically doing. Coping mechanisms are things that we do specifically to give relief or to help us work through something. So we could say that a coping mechanism is a behavior where it's like it helps us kind of take the edge off or, move forward in some way or just to make things a bit easier. Yeah, so basically behavior would be, oh, I notice myself biting my nails. I could name off a shadow aspect for that and explore that. Or I notice myself generally avoiding social situations, or like whenever I'm invited to a social situation, I just lose heart for it by the time it's time to go. That's a behavior. Now, So that might be like a reluctant, I guess, reluctant emerald, or, like party canceler emerald or something of that nature. And then we have coping mechanisms. So let's say coping mechanism would be something like, let's say that I had like an addiction or something like that. So let's say if I was addicted to drinking alcohol, so I might label that aspect alcohol emerald or alcoholic emerald. And so I can look and I can see and question at a deeper level why that coping mechanism would come up. And so again, we're looking just at the symptoms, the things that we're aware of, and then we're going to explore those down to the roots. Then we have feeling states. So feeling states would be things like, oh, I always find myself feeling anxiety. So that would be anxious emerald. Or I find myself getting really frustrated in these situations and I'm not sure why. Oh, that's frustration emerald. Or I find myself feeling a sense of futility, or feeling powerless, or, whatever it happens to be. And basically being able to name out aspects for those. So futile emerald, or let's say a powerless emerald. And then I can also name off shadow aspects for untapped potentials. So basically, oftentimes we think about the shadow as only home to negative things, but that's not true. There's plenty of positive things about each of our shadow aspects. And so basically, untapped potentials could be something like, let's say if we have experienced a certain type of trauma or unmet needs such that we weren't able to express creativity, and now we have an aspect of ourselves that's very creative in the shadow. And maybe sometimes, maybe at 4 o'clock in the morning, we wake up and we just get all these great ideas for creative projects when we typically don't have that so much up at the surface. I could name that aspect creative emerald because I see that it's there. There's a symptom that it's there, but maybe that it's typically underneath the surface of consciousness. So these would be just different ways to label out shadow aspects. Now, one thing that I do mention in the actual recorded part of the workshop is that you can also name off shadow aspects based off of characters and symbols that show up in dreams. And so I'll talk about a little bit about that toward the end of the second part of this. All right, and so that's how to identify a shadow aspect. Now, I wanted to tell you a bit about these two particular types of shadow aspects. So we have protector aspects and we have vulnerable aspects. So protector aspects are basically aspects that are there to either protect or serve yourself or your more vulnerable aspects. So basically, these aspects are there and they're there to do work to help you either avoid facing with aspects that are in the shadow or avoid re-traumatization in general. And then we have vulnerable aspects, and these are shadow aspects that usually have bore the brunt of trauma or an unmet need or are dealing with shame. And so within the context of, let's say, internal family systems and parts work, basically the protector aspects could be thought of as being a little bit like the firefighters and I'm forgetting what it is, the firefighters and the managers, and then the vulnerable aspects could be sort of like the exiles. So the vulnerable aspects are the parts that are usually pushed the furthest down in the shadow, the ones that we want to get away from the most because they're dealing with the most intense emotions. And so basically protector aspects are usually up closer to the surface. So you're more likely to have symptoms rise above the surface that are more like the protector aspects. So that's something to keep in mind. Oftentimes what can happen as well is we might have one vulnerable aspect with many different protectors around it. So a single vulnerable aspect might have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, different protection mechanisms depending. So that's something also to keep in mind. And so let me give really quick, I'm going to give a list of a bunch of different common shadow aspects. And with this list, I want you to basically kind of notice any that stand out to you as reflecting either protector aspects of yourself or vulnerable aspects of yourself. And, just from working with people and helping them pinpoint out their shadow aspects, these are some of the most common ones that I see. But of course, this is not an exhaustive list. But basically, after this, I'm going to have you do an exercise where you list off 10 potential shadow aspects that you have, either using this common shadow aspects worksheet or using the method that I had mentioned before. So basically, the agendas plus your first name. So if I have an agenda toward, let's say, trying to impress people, maybe that show off emerald, or if I have an agenda toward achievement, achiever emerald, or if I have a feeling state where it's like I'm, let's say, feeling anxious, that's anxious emerald. And so that would be one way. And then also you can also just look at this list and see if there's anything that resonates with you here. And these are very, very common. Okay, so protector aspects. Okay, so the self-judging aspect. So the self-judging aspect is a really destructive protector aspect. I will say that is that basically it's I'm going to judge myself before others can judge me, and so we end up with a lot of negative self-talk with this one. Um, then we have the avoidant aspect. This could be avoidant really toward anything. It could be social avoidance, or it could be just avoiding certain uncomfortable situations in general. So this one's sort of a protector that keeps you away from emotions you don't want to face with. Then we have the people pleasing aspect. This is the aspect that, basically tries to people please. Oftentimes, this is a fear of conflict, so it's sort of like protecting from feelings of conflict, or protecting from relationship disrepair, or sometimes even protecting from feelings of shame or rejection. So maybe a person might think, oh, if I'm not people pleasing, then I'm going to be rejected, or I'm not going to be good enough. Can also be a way for a person to build a positive self identity to get away from shame as well. And then we have the procrastinator aspect. This one is really, really common. This can come up for a variety of different reasons. It could be because we don't really want to be doing the thing that we think we do, or it could be that we experience uncomfortable emotions when we go from the transition of not working to working. So there can be a variety of different reasons why the procrastinator aspect comes up. And sometimes they relate to self sabotage in general. And self sabotage can come up because of fear of what we're going to experience on the other side of success, or the potential for failure as well. Um, then we have the self-doubting aspect. So similar to the self-judging aspect, the self-doubting aspect is really a self-inflicted wound. So it's quite harmful. But basically the self-doubting aspect is there to kind of make sure that we don't make too many bold moves, or that we don't trust ourselves too much. Can come from like lack of self-trust, especially if there have been times where we actually have betrayed our own trust in the past. And so basically the self-doubting aspect could be a way to sort of like police yourself and keep yourself from being too bold in your actions, or being too sure of yourself, or it's basically not wanting to. Oh, here's a good actually a good analogy for self-doubting and self-judging and self-shaming of any type. As imagine that you or let's say a little kid in a hot air balloon, right? And the little kid is just rising up, 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 and like he hasn't experienced anything negative yet, right? And so and then somebody in who's close to him, maybe parents, maybe family members, come along and they pop that hot air balloon, and then from way, way up high, it's like that hot air balloon comes crashing down, and it's really painful because he kind of got his hopes up. But let's say that if this child knew that somebody was going to come along and pop the hot air balloon, what he would do is he would actually pop his own hot air balloon before he gets too far off the ground, so that he avoids getting his hopes up, so that he avoids crashing down and being disappointed. So oftentimes self-judging and self-doubting can come from that as well. So it's like, oh, I'm gonna hedge my bets, I'm gonna doubt myself so I don't experience that disappointment. Then we have the self-blaming aspect. So the self-blaming aspect, this one is usually a protection mechanism for powerlessness. So if we have a vulnerable aspect that feels powerless, we can oftentimes, because powerlessness, it feels so intensely bad. It's like one of the worst feelings that we can feel as a human being, the most intensely negative feelings, because powerlessness means no ability to get out of an unwanted situation. So it can feel very dooming. And so basically, whenever we experience something that makes us feel powerless, oftentimes what we'll do is we'll cope through creating the story that, oh, I wasn't powerless in that situation. In fact, I had full control and I just didn't match up to the standard that I was capable of. And so blaming ourselves can be a way to avoid feelings of powerlessness by saying, oh, actually, I did have full power and control and I just failed. And so, even though that's quite a painful thing to hear someone say, it is actually a protection mechanism when they start to blame themselves. And then we have the ruminating aspect. The ruminating aspect is basically like it's going to go around and around and around in the head and keep you away from those emotions underneath the surface. And then we have the rationalizing aspect. So this would be something like, oh, I see that just happened for this reason, so I shouldn't be feeling that way. It basically kind of puts a lot of shoulds and should nots onto things, and it tries to basically push away maybe certain feelings and that type of thing. It's very similar to the minimizing aspect. The minimizing aspect is like, oh, it's no big deal, no biggie, that type of thing. And then we have like the judging aspect. So this is sort of like external judging, so like judging others. And oftentimes this one can be hard for people when they notice themselves judging, because there's so much of a stigma around having judgment. It's like, oh no, if I judge, then that's a bad thing to do and I need to stop the judging. But oftentimes there's a real vulnerability underneath that the judging is trying to essentially remedy. And so, with that, there could be sort of feelings of inferiority, and we're judging others so that we can feel superior. So, it's a way to cope with shame. Um, then we have the anger aspect. Anger always comes up in response to powerlessness. So, the anger aspect could be a response. The anger aspect basically could be a response to moving away from powerlessness. Then we have the blending in aspect. What this means is like when a person tries to blend into the crowd, wants to invisibilize themselves, they don't want to stand out too much, they don't want to be seen too much. And so they're trying to basically avoid standing out, probably because they maybe fearing shame, maybe fearing judgment, fearing, especially if there was some kind of unsafety around being noticed, they might try to blend into the background. Like, so for example, maybe somebody who was badly bullied as a child might want to blend in, so that they don't stand out, because it's sort of like the nail that sticks up gets hammered, and if that's what they've experienced, they might try to blend in. We have the body shaming aspect, or any kind of self-shaming aspect, is I'm going to police something about myself so that I don't get the judgment from the outsider. So I don't, so I'm not deemed unworthy or unlovable from the outside. Then we have the rigid aspect. So basically, this is kind of like rigid, black and white thinking, not wanting to like explore. It's sort of like, nope, it's just this way. And oftentimes this comes up because keeping a very narrow perspective or a very rigid perspective is a way to avoid certain parts of the self that are outside of that lens. Then we have the overthinking aspect. And the overthinking aspect basically would be something like, the worrying and like constantly going around and around the head. It's very similar to the ruminating aspect, because it keeps you up in the mind and not in the emotions, not in where these more vulnerable aspects are. Another protector is the overworking aspect, where we start focusing toward work so much, and we're externalizing our focus, and again, not sitting with those more vulnerable aspects of ourselves. Now, the addicted aspect, the way that addiction could basically be defined, and I heard somebody else describe it this way, is like we're down in this negative situation, we're down in the hole, and then the addiction gives us temporary reprieve from being in the hole. So let's say in the hole we're experiencing really negative feelings like shame or like powerlessness, but when we engage with the addiction, it gives us temporary relief. And then we end up back down in it, and basically we end up in this cycle of going back and forth with that. And an addiction can be really anything that's used for that. So it could be something like some substance like alcohol, or cigarettes or heroin, or it could be something that would be considered more of a soft addiction, things like scrolling around on the phone, or distracting yourself, or anything like that. Um, another protector aspect is an aspect that would be in the head too much. So basically, if an aspect is in the head too much, uh, when an aspect is in the head too much, basically it's like avoiding different feelings that are going on in the body. So a lot of times people become really, really cerebral and kind of hide in the mental area to avoid stuff going on in their body and the more vulnerable feelings that are arising in the body. Then we have the expression squelching aspect. This is basically a part of the self that's trying to keep us from expressing ourselves because of maybe fear of judgment, maybe fear that if we express ourselves, somebody else is going to get hurt, or something of that nature. And so having the tendency to keep expression back is also a protector aspect. Then there's a responsibility averse aspect. Responsibility averse aspect often comes up in children who are expected to be responsible for their parents' emotions or responsible too early for things that were beyond their developmental capacity to be responsible for. And then we have the humility aspect. And the humility aspect is basically having to do, now, humility as itself is a very helpful trait. Let me say this first. And humility, it's sort of like when you can understand that you don't know everything and you can kind of like, sort of let go and not feel like you have to be the best at everything. Of course, there's a lot of positivity there. The way that I find humility being used as a protection mechanism is sort of like it's like building this identity of humility, and then we become really self-deprecating and we avoid parts of ourself that are more sovereign or more responsible. And so basically humility can be a way of like sort of undercutting ourselves, and we can also be trying to fulfill an identity of goodness to get away from shame. And so it's like, oh look, I'm humble and I'm good, and we might be undercutting our own power because we feel like our power would bring us shame in some way, which can lead to this other aspect over here called the dethroned sovereign, which I'll talk about shortly. All right, so those are some common protector aspects. Here are some common vulnerable aspects. So the shame aspect. So the shame aspect is basically I'm no good, I'm evil, I'm bad, I'm unworthy, I don't belong here, there's something wrong with me. It's all of these types of beliefs. Basically, it's this sense of invalidity. And so basically, when an aspect of ourself feels this, this can be a really intense trauma, and a lot of different protection mechanisms can exist specifically to get away from shame. And then we have the powerless aspect. The powerless aspect often is because we're in a situation where we didn't have any control. We're in an unwanted situation that we couldn't bring into being a wanted situation. And so that feeling of powerlessness that's there, basically, we could deal with that by, like, let's say, going into anger, or we could maybe ignore it through distracting ourselves or rationalizing it away. So we have a lot of different protection mechanisms we might use to avoid the sense of powerlessness. Self-blaming is another one. And then we have the grieving aspect. So whenever we experience loss, and the way I would describe loss is this, and grief is this, is let's say I've anchored myself into, let's say, a person or a place or an object or an idea. It doesn't matter really what it is that I've become attached to, but I've anchored my energy into investing in this person, place, thing, or idea. And then let's say all of a sudden this person, place, thing, or idea gets taken away. And now I have all of this energy outside of myself, and I'm trying to basically like grasp at what's been lost, and I'm trying to essentially work through all these, like, multifaceted kind of feelings. And so with grief, it's a really it's kind of a longer winded process to be able to bring your energy back into yourself once you experience a loss. And so whenever we don't do that, aspects that are dealing with grief can end up in the shadow. um, and especially one to look for if you've experienced great loss but didn't experience a lot of emotion around it. So that might be something to look around for. Then we have the desperate aspect. So basically, whenever an aspect has an unmet need, ultimately because needs have to be met in order for these aspects to be conscious, they're going to be very desperate to get those needs met. And so I like to think about it as like somebody sort of wandering through the desert and looking for an oasis, looking for water. And if you could imagine that someone could wander around for decades without water and survive, and the level of desperation that's there, sometimes these aspects with unmet needs feel that way. And so it might vary from aspect to aspect as to what their needs are. Maybe their need is for connection or belonging, or maybe their need is for power, like maybe they have sort of like a sense of powerlessness and maybe they need genuine power, or they could have a variety of different things they might need. And then we have the love starved aspect. This is the aspect that hasn't really fully felt like it can receive love, or at least not unconditionally. We have validation seeking aspect. So again, it's sort of like if they were looking for validation from the parents, but the parents never quite gave them the validation. And like, let's say if they got an A and it's like, oh, well, why wasn't it an A plus? Like, then that might leave someone with a validation seeking aspect in the shadow. Um, then the voiceless aspect. So this is basically, the person who couldn't speak or express themselves as a child without there being bad consequences, or in other circumstances without there being negative consequences. Then we have the unwanted aspect. So this is sort of like the aspect that is, feels shameful, feels like, oh, nobody wants me, and usually is based off of, certain circumstances, usually in childhood where they felt unwanted. Um, then we have the empty aspect. So this is the aspect that feels a sense of futility, kind of a void feeling with this one. And so it can be quite an uncomfortable feeling to sit with. And so this is often why this aspect might be in the shadow. Then we have the rejected aspect. So basically, this is one that's experienced rejection and perhaps even abandonment, which is the next aspect over. And so oftentimes these aspects can go into anxious and avoidance protection strategies to try to avoid being rejected or avoid being abandoned by clinging on, or to reject or abandon first by running, by being the first to run away. Then we have the terror aspect, or really any other type of fear like terror, panic. Those are really intense emotions to process through. It's really, really difficult to be with fear. So oftentimes aspects that are dealing with traumas around fear are cast into the shadow. Then we have the overburdened aspect. So this would be sort of the child aspect that had to take on too much responsibility too quickly. And so that can sort of end up generating the responsibility averse protector aspect. Um, then we have the uprooted aspect. Oftentimes, I find this in clients who had to move around a lot as a child and weren't able to really set down roots, or people who, let's say, moved. Oh, oops, sorry about that. Or let's say people who moved long distances away from, let's say, their home community and that type of thing, like people who moved to a different country. And so oftentimes there's a lot of, basically whenever you're uprooted like that, it's kind of like you really need time to be able to kind of get back rooted in the new situation. But then it's like you have to be able to grieve all the losses that are there, and sometimes it's such an intense and especially if there's a constant uprooting where a person moved around a lot as a kid, it might not give them the necessary time to really get adjusted. And these uprooted aspects can become quite avoidant socially because they don't want to make too many ties and connection for fear of being uprooted again. So that one's a common one. Then we sort of in a similar vein, we have the homeless aspect. And the reason why I put the home in scare quotes there is that basically there's this sense that we get when we feel valid, when we feel at home in the universe. And whenever we feel uprooted or whenever we feel shame, we get this sense that we're kind of like sort of rudderless and that we don't belong here, and we're not really fully anchored and rooted in home here in the universe. And this can lead to feelings of unsafety as well and feelings of fear. Um, then we have the hated aspect. This is very similar to the shame aspect, but it's sort of like there's more of a direct like self-hatred, like part of you hating on another part of you, and the other part internalizing that. The bitter aspect. So again, that's that bitter feeling. So it's sort of like sadness and anger mixed. So an aspect feeling that would feel that sense of bitterness. Then we have the useless tool aspect. So basically, with this, oftentimes when we're raised in an environment that values us for how it is that we're achieving and what it is that we're doing, as opposed to who we are as people and just our very existence as us, what can happen is we start to conceptualize ourselves as fundamentally a tool, and we sort to see, or kind of there's we sort of determine our value based off of our utility or our ability to achieve something. And so basically, because we start to conceptualize of ourselves as tools or utilitarian beings that have to prove their worth by proving that they can do X, Y, and Z thing or be X, Y, and Z kind of way, then ultimately there's a fear of becoming the useless tool. It's like, oh no, I'm the hammer that doesn't work. I'm the screwdriver that doesn't work, right? And so it's like, what do we do to the hammer that doesn't work? We throw it in the garbage. So it's basically like the shame aspect. It's this sense of like we're sort of objectifying ourselves and we're saying like, oh no, we're not good enough objects to exist. And so we don't have a purpose if we're the useless tool. And so oftentimes if we have a very objectifying way of looking at ourselves that sees ourselves as only uh, a let's say, a utilitarian kind of object in a way, then this can come up as well. Then we have the enmeshed aspect. So enmeshment is where you're made to view yourself as like a character in someone else's story. So if there's an aspect that views itself as part of your mom's story or your dad's story or somebody else's story, then that would be an enmeshed aspect. Then we have the dethroned sovereign aspect. So basically, internally, we all have this anchor point, this centering in our own sovereignty. But whenever we experience shame, especially, and powerlessness, and we start to self-doubt and sort of self-judge and things like that, we sort of knock our internal sovereign off of its throne. So personal sovereignty is a really, really common thing that I work with my clients. Then we have the rage aspect. So the rage aspect could actually fit in either category. So anger is a protection mechanism against powerlessness that's meant to fight back against powerlessness. And in the cases where anger doesn't lead through to actually fighting back against powerlessness, that goes to frustration and eventually rage, which is unresolved anger, unresolved powerlessness. And so basically, we could say that rage is a protector aspect because it's trying to work for us. It's trying to do something positive. It's trying to bring us out of a powerless situation. But it's also a vulnerable aspect because rage comes about through a situation being unmanageable. Like, so let's say that we have like a brick wall and we're caught behind the brick wall and there's no way to get around it or above it or under it, and we can't get through it, and so we're just kind of there, and we don't have any ability to get ourselves out from behind the brick wall. Then basically we're going to feel feelings of frustration and rage arise, and so it's also a vulnerable aspect as well. Then we have the disoriented aspect. So this can come from a sense of not being at home in the universe, so the homeless, the dethroned sovereign, and then also just feeling the sense of being uprooted and kind of wayward. And so what happens with the disoriented aspect is it doesn't get a clear sense of up and down and left and right. And, basically like there's nothing to give context to it. So in this sense, it sort of like feels a bit lost, so you could call this disoriented aspect the lost aspect. All right, so these are all of the common shadow aspects that I can think of. There are, of course, other ones. This is not an exhaustive list, but what I'm going to have you do now is I'm going to have you name some shadow aspects. So on a piece of paper, write down at least 10 shadow aspects based on the symptoms of how those shadow aspects express in your life. So remember, you can identify your shadow aspects based on agendas, behaviors, coping mechanisms, feeling states, and untapped potentials. So you can go and you can look at your life and you can sort of pinpoint things, and that's one way to do it. And I would recommend doing some of that. But you can also look at the common shadow aspects list here, and you can basically, anything that feels relevant here, you can utilize that in your list. Yeah, and so basically this is it for the very first part of the video, that first 30 minutes or so. And with this one, it's basically all about being able to pinpoint and name out your shadow aspects. Go ahead and take about 5-10 minutes to do that, to name off your 10 shadow aspects. And then once you do that, go ahead and you can watch part 2 of this video. And during part 2 of this video, we're going to be exploring more into that, and we're going to be talking about how to ask questions of those aspects. All right, thank you. See you in part 2. All right, so as you finish up with yours, if anyone would like to share, go ahead and write your shadow aspects in the comment section. Gotcha, so the hated aspect, I see. Gotcha. Procrastinator, self-doubting, shame, rationalizing, self-judging, shame aspect. I have a question. What's the difference between the vulnerable and protected aspects? So the vulnerable ones are the ones that are really dealing with the traumas and unmet needs and shame. And the protector aspects are trying to protect the rest of the personality from that. All right, so I see some responsibility averse aspects, judging and self-judging, humility, minimizing, expression sculpting, the responsibility averse aspect, powerless aspect, validation seeking, procrastinator, most of the vulnerable aspects. So rejected and abandoned aspects, desperate, empty, minimizing, let's see, okay. Body shaming, procrastinator. Okay. Yeah, so it seems like a lot of people have the procrastinator one. I definitely have that one too. Yeah, self-judging, useless tool, avoidant, ruminating, overthinking. Yeah, so oftentimes with the avoidant and the ruminating and overthinking, basically it can be basically ruminating and overthinking can be a means of avoiding uncomfortable emotions. So that would make sense. Body shaming, expression squelching. Oftentimes expression squelching can come from the fear of what's going to come about as a result of speaking your truth. Let's see. Okay. Unrealistic self-perception. Yeah, so that's a good one that's not on the list. Yeah, so unrealistic self-perception would be like you create an idea of yourself and maybe it's to avoid shame, you know. So this is probably a protector aspect that's there to avoid shame. Overburden, overstool. All right. Oh, show off aspect, fish out of water aspect. Yeah, those are some good ones. Yeah, so showing off, sometimes showing off can come from a variety of different places. So one could be there's a genuine need for attention. Showing off could also be, oh, I have to show off in order to get love, or oh, I have to, like in the case of somebody like showing off to prove their worth in some way, oftentimes that can be to get away from feelings of inferiority caused by shame. Fish out of water aspects. So that would be like not belonging, you know, and those type of feelings. Chelsea T says, is it normal to have most of these aspects? And I would say yes, these are very, very common, very, very human, you know, so a lot of people are going to have them. Okay, let's see. Oh, I had a question here too. So from a biological evolutionary perspective, why do you think we have protector and vulnerable aspects? You know, I don't know if I could necessarily speak to the biological or evolutionary perspective, but in terms of the functional perspective, ultimately, like whenever an aspect that whenever we experience an emotion that's too big to process, or we actually, you know, we have unmet needs, the shadow actually exists there as a bit of a mercy for us to be able to put those aspects away and to not focus on them so much and to move forward in our life. So it really exists there as a coping mechanism, albeit with some side effects. But, you know, instead of, let's say, being there with an emotion that's unresolvable or too overwhelming or not going to help us in the moment, we can actually focus toward what is going well and to move forward in that sense. And so I would say from a practical perspective, that's why we have shadow aspects, and that's why we have essentially these protector aspects that are trying to keep our shadow aspects in the shadow. So the shadow really is all about keeping homeostasis and stability. And these protector aspects are there to kind of hold things together. But when we're going in and we're doing the process of shadow work, we're trying to kind of make these protector aspects jobs obsolete and to come back into a state of integration and wholeness, which is also part of our functions as well. So that's a great question. So shame, procrastinator, uprooted, love starved, overthinking, not belonging, powerlessness, shame, rage, abandoned. Let's see. Okay. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you all for sharing. Afraid of being ignored, that's another one that's a bit different. Validation seeking. Gotcha. Yeah. So Maria said, useless tool. I used to call myself the mule for everyone to use. Yeah. So that one would be a common one. Distracted. Yeah. The distracted aspect. So distracted, unfocused, leading to procrastinations. Yeah. So difficulty focusing can be something you can name out as a shadow aspect as well. Okay. All right. Blaming. Okay. The less than feeling, yeah, so that would definitely relate to shame there. The isolation aspect, that's a good one to put down. I didn't put down anything related to loneliness, so if anyone has an isolation aspect, that would be a common one as well. All right. Okay. Alrighty. Yeah, so let's go ahead and we'll move on from this exercise now that you have your shadow aspects, and we'll go to we'll go and we'll take a quick break. So since we got started a bit later, we'll just do a 5-minute break. And so at 1:10 Eastern, or so 10 minutes after, depending on where you're at, we'll go ahead and we'll come back and we'll do the second part of the workshop. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Alrighty. So can I get whoever is sharing to go to the 14th slide, from symptoms to roots? Okay, to be the next one over. Yeah, okay, there we go. Yep. So basically, what we're going to be focusing on now that you've named off some aspects. So once you've identified them, you can start asking questions to these aspects. And so basically, once you notice the symptom, you can start exploring the symptom down to their root. And so I'm going to be sharing with you some powerful questions that you can ask these aspects to get down to the roots of why they're behaving the way they're behaving, or why they feel the way that they feel. Um, so basically, going back to that carrot metaphor, the root vegetable metaphor, it's like when you can notice the symptoms, when you can notice the leaves poking up above the surface, you can use the leaves to actually uproot the carrot itself, or the root vegetable itself. And so basically what we'll be doing is, now that we've pinpointed out what the leaves are, we can start to explore the leaves, and we can start to figure out how those leaves came to grow as they do. Yeah, so basically, we're going to be looking at the symptoms, and we're going to try to get deeper and deeper down to the roots, which basically, if you go and you ask yourself questions, you can get down to the roots quite a lot easier. Um, so going into the next slide, which is called laddering. So basically laddering is basically a type of interview style or communication style, where you continually ask very simple questions to to basically explore the underlying subconscious motive of either the person you're talking to, or you can also explore in terms of like an aspect of yours. And so laddering is actually really good, like if you're working as a coach with someone and you want to kind of, let's say if they're procrastinating and you want to help them get to the bottom of things, you can ask them a ladder style question. So an example would be something like, oh, I find myself procrastinating. And it's kind of like being the quintessential annoying little kid that says, why? So basically, if it's like, oh, I've been procrastinating, it's like, well, why do you think you're procrastinating? It's like, oh, I just feel so like lazy and lackluster. It's like, well, why do you think you feel that way? Why do you think you feel that sense of laziness? And it's just, oh, I just feel like I have no energy. And then you can kind of go and you can switch up that question. You can go like, oh, what do you think is leading to you having no energy? And like basically from there, you can continue exploring deeper and deeper and deeper until you come to the deepest answer that you can. And so basically you in this type of question, you respond to whatever the previous answer was with another question about that response. So especially why questions, it's not just why questions, you can really ask other questions too, be very intuitive about it. But basically, the idea of laddering is like, if you imagine you're starting on the surface and then you're going to take a ladder straight down, and then you're going to explore the surface, and then you take another ladder down, and so on and so on and so on. So it's a way of getting deeper and deeper down into the reasons why your shadow aspect is doing what it's doing. So this is really good for finding underlying motivations, which is also good for, going from a protector aspect that might be more toward the surface to a more vulnerable aspect that's underneath. Um, can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Yeah, so laddering with shadow aspects. So I have another example here. So let's say we have a people-pleasing aspect. So the question is, why am I people pleasing, right? So I might ask myself, why am I people pleasing? It's like, oh, because I'm afraid of conflict. If I stop being a people pleaser, maybe other people aren't going to like me, that type of thing. And so then what I might say is, well, why am I so afraid of conflict? Or why am I so afraid that other people won't like me? And then I'll write here, maybe it's because I'm afraid that conflict will destroy my relationships. And so then that begs the question, why do I feel like conflict destroys relationships? And it's, maybe I come up with the answer because when I experienced conflict with my parents, it left a permanent unresolved emotional wedge between them and I, so that would like be an example. And then underneath that, it's how did that emotional wedge make me feel? It's like, so if I switch to kind of a how question now in terms of how it's making me feel, I can start to kind of pinpoint out what the vulnerable aspects underneath that might be. So how did that emotional wedge make me feel? So probably powerless and rejected. And so we can see that the symptom is people pleasing as a protector shadow aspect, and the vulnerable aspect that it protects is the powerless and rejected shadow aspect. Now, sometimes you can go kind of in different directions with this as well. So maybe I might get curious, like, so with this question of why do I feel like conflict destroys relationships, I might even ask the question as like, can other people have conflict and not destroy their relationships, but it's something about me having conflict that destroys relationships? It's something that I make a meaning that it's more personal to myself. So we can really kind of flesh this out a bit more with the laddering. But basically the idea is you ask a question about the symptom, then you basically answer it, and then you ask a question about that answer, and then you answer it, and then you ask a question about that question and you answer it. And so basically the idea is that you're gradually going down and you're exploring more and more, and you're learning more and more about your shadow aspects in the way. Yeah, so any questions about laddering questions with shadow aspects? And you can put them down in the chat box below here, and if I see any that stand out to me, I'll go ahead and I'll answer those. Gotcha. How to work with numbness. Okay, so let's say numbness. Numbness, I would guess, is probably a protector aspect, a more emotional protector aspect. And so basically, you can ask the question of like, let's say, let's say, what are the situations where I feel numb? It's like, oh, I feel numb, let's say in X, Y, and Z situation. And it's like, well, and I guess with numbness specifically, it's like you're trying to protect yourself. Well, what is numbness trying to protect me from? It's like, oh, well, if I experience emotions too strongly, it's going to make me feel X, Y, and Z thing. It's like, why would that be so bad to feel X, Y, and Z thing? So that would be like an example of a way to like ladder down with numbness specifically. But I would say with numbness, a lot of times numbness, we can explain that in a more physiological kind of way. So basically, if we think about it from the perspective of the nervous system, so the nervous system is basically the brain, the spinal cord, and all the nerves in the body. When we experience a trauma, what's happening is we essentially have an overload of emotions that are hitting the nervous system all at once that can't be processed in one sitting. And so basically the mind and body then work together to shut those down. And basically the way the body does that is through the parasympathetic nervous system, which brings us typically into rest and digest, but it can also bring us into numbness and flatness and depression and things like that. So it's like, let's say that we get hit with a really traumatic emotion that's too big to process, like shame. Well, what's probably going to happen, because it's really hard to be present with shame because it's too big to process, is the parasympathetic nervous system is going to shut things down. We're going to go numb to it, and then we're going to basically keep it away. So I would say this one probably is better served by somatic work and really feeling into the numbness, but you can question it and kind of like ladder down and see, oh, how long have I felt numb, and asking questions like that. So that's what I would recommend when it comes to numbness. All right, so let's see. What's the next step once we find out the link between the protector and the vulnerable aspects? Yeah, so basically Stephanie had asked this. So Stephanie, what I would recommend here is starting with a third person perspective on the aspects. So it's like, and basically this is what we're focused on in today's workshop, but basically like you can say that, oh, okay, here's my protector aspect. I know, and I have this vulnerable aspect that's down in the shadow. And so it's like coming to know those aspects from a third person perspective. Now, the next step to take from there is to try to get into the first person perspective of the vulnerable aspect and start to feel those emotions directly and to come back into the moment where it was repressed. That way it can move past that moment. But it might take, that can be kind of an intense process, and it can be kind of a longer process because it takes a while to process through those emotions in a way that's sustainable, because we want to maintain emotional regulation at the same time. So today's class is basically about understanding these aspects from like sort of a third person point of perspective. So if we have the conscious personality, we have our shadow aspects and we have our protector aspects. Basically with that, it's kind of like we're looking and we're getting kind of a bird's eye view and we're sort of observing how those aspects work. Whereas like the next step to take from there would be to start trying to either create visualizations to get into the first person perspective or to feel into the emotions directly. Okay. All right. Let's see, are the hated aspect and the people pleasing related in any way? There's a possibility that the hated aspect and the people pleasing aspect could be related. So basically, like, let's say the hated aspect, that ultimately that relates back to shame. And so if a person is people pleasing and trying to make sure other people like them, they could be trying to get away from feelings of shame by making sure that they're not disapproved of by others. Like that would be an example of how those two could be related. But of course, it's going to be different in every circumstance. So they may or may not be related. Um, so how can we be sure about the reason that comes from why? Is it just personal intuition? Yeah, so you really want to use your intuition with this. You want to get a sense and kind of trust whatever comes up as you're asking the questions. Gotcha. So the goal of laddering is to find more of what the vulnerable aspects are. So yes, that's definitely one of the goals of laddering. But laddering in general helps you get a really strong understanding of how these aspects are working in general, and they can even help you. Let's say if you have a certain protector aspect and it's not impacting your life in the way that you want it to. After you get more and more awareness from this kind of bird's eye view observer perspective, you can start to notice sort of the mechanism at work and you can actually choose to consciously like respond a different way. So that could be another goal of laddering as well, because the more you know about your shadow aspects, the more you can start to notice different things that might lead you down paths you don't want to go down. Um, do you recommend working with someone if you are not good working on shadow aspects because of pain and trauma? I would say that it's definitely helpful to get, like somebody's help with it and, to have somebody there to work with. I know that I really highly benefited from, let's say, seeing like coaches before and things like that. And I even saw a therapist for a short bit. And so having somebody else there can be quite helpful. Um, let's see. Let's see, I seem to have a short circuiting aspect that cuts off my train of thought as soon as I start asking myself important questions. Yeah, I've had clients that have had that short circuiting thing. That's a protector aspect. So basically, it's sort of like I had said before, the mind and body have different ways of working together to try to keep you from facing with uncomfortable emotions that are going on in the shadow. And so that short circuiting, what that's doing is that's trying to keep you from actually looking at the shadow. It's trying to kind of bring you out and pop you back into your default state of consciousness. So yeah, that's one that I've seen before. Um, do you recommend the exercises being done in tandem if you are not very objective of yourself? I guess like I would say, just I wouldn't worry too much about objectivity. I would kind of go more toward intuition and just see what comes up for you there. And then just try to, basically, if you notice that you're having a hard time kind of trusting what comes up, treat that as an aspect as well, because that could also be a protection mechanism. Say, oh, why don't I trust what's coming up? Like, and, kind of question into that. Um, okay. All right. All right. Let's see. I got the question, what if nothing really wrong happened in my life or childhood? So basically, what I would say is that even if there were no major terrible events, we do lose aspects to the shadow because we maybe make a decision about like things being a certain way and not the other way. So our worldview goes into it. Also, our ideas about ourselves, when we say I'm like this and I'm not like that, can go into it. Can also have to do with our beliefs around what's shameful and what's not shameful. So that's kind of more in the worldview kind of concern element of things. You could also be experiencing unmet needs and not really know it. So oftentimes when people have unmet needs, because there's no huge event or anything and there's no contrast, a lot of times there can be aspects that have unmet needs. So what I would say is even if there wasn't any major like terrible type of situations, you could still kind of pinpoint out different symptoms that might be showing up from shadow, or different behaviors or coping mechanisms that you notice, and sort of explore those down to see where they might come from. Okay. Okay, I tend to have a big resistance to questioning myself. How can I reduce this resistance to observing my own shadows? So great question. So basically, with the resistance to questioning yourself in and of itself, you want to think about that as a protector aspect. So what I would do is if I had that aspect, I would say, oh, I have a resistance to questioning myself, Emerald. And then I would go and I would work directly with that aspect and try to ladder down and see what it's trying to protect you from. Um, let's see, I'll go ahead and I'll go to one more. Let's go. Okay. Okay. What about being afraid to make mistakes? Yeah, so that's a common one. So basically, a lot of times that can be because of fear of failure or fear of experiencing shame as a result of failure and that type of thing. Perfectionism can come up there. So those are really common ones that aren't on the shadow aspects list. Yeah, so what I would do is if I had that, the aspect that's afraid to make mistakes, let's say, I'd be like, oh, a fear of making mistakes, Emerald. It's not the catchiest thing, but let's say I would label off an aspect and I would say, why am I afraid of making mistakes? And it's like, because I'm afraid if I make mistakes that it means that I'm stupid. It's like, well, why, let's say, why would that be so bad to be stupid? What would that entail? What does that mean? It's like, oh, well, that would mean that such and so is right about me all along, or that would mean that like I'm going to get overlooked in these instances, or I'm going to be, just, basically there can be a lot of different reasons, so basically it's kind of starting with that question of why am I afraid to make mistakes? It's like maybe it could be because I'm afraid of what others will think, or it could be because I'm afraid of failing, or because, X, Y, and Z reason, but basically kind of like looking deeper and deeper at aspects. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and I'll move on to the next part here. So go ahead and move to the next slide, please, the person who's sharing. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so basically these are some questions also that you can ask your protector aspects. So this is a good, handful of questions that can lead you down sort of like a path toward exploring the roots at a deeper level. So basically, what is this protector aspect's job? So protector aspects, basically, they're there to be the managers and the firefighters. They always have a job. They're trying to serve you or protect you in some way. So for example, if I'm looking at the people pleaser aspect, which is a protector aspect, I might ask, well, what's this protector aspect's job? Well, it's like, well, it keeps it keeps my relationship smooth. It makes it to where I don't have to experience conflict. It, protects me from relationship disrepair. It makes me feel like a good person. These types of things. And so then the next question would be, how old were you when it began doing this job? So if I think about my experiences with people pleasing, that probably came around about like age 12 or so. So I decided that I was going to be like a really, really nice person. And then that was going to be like a huge part of my identity. And so like people pleasing came along with that idea of being the nice person. So it's kind of serving an identity as well. And this identity made me feel really good about myself in ways that I hadn't felt good about myself before. And then is this protector aspect serving you more than it's harming you, or is it harming you more than it's serving you? So this is an important question to ask. So oftentimes our protection mechanisms can serve us in some ways and harm us in others. And what I would say always, as a bit of a caveat here, is if you notice yourself employing some kind of protection mechanism or coping mechanism, you don't want to immediately start to pull that coping mechanism out from under you, because sometimes it can be doing important work and you can be relying on it. It can be a weight-bearing coping mechanism. So for example, if I noticed that I were people pleasing and I'm like, oh gosh, no, that's coming from this bad place and I have to get rid of it, and I stopped and I still needed it, well, what would happen is I would probably just be trying to cope in some other kind of way, but maybe not coping quite as well as I did before. So you really want to question, is this protector aspect serving you more than harming you, or is it harming you more than serving you? So in this case, if I think about my experiences with people pleasing in the past, I would say that at a certain point in time, it was harming me more than serving me. So it was like if I was in a situation where my boundaries were going to be gone over, and maybe I was in those types of situations at certain points in time, then it would be harming me more than serving me. But if I were in a situation where I had kind of curated like my group of people that I'm spending time around, maybe in that sense, there are fewer people there that are going to try to step over those boundaries and take advantage. And so it's going to depend from situation to situation. But ultimately, I want to take stock of both the ways that this aspect is serving me and harming me. So maybe being a people pleaser is serving me in the sense that, oh, I experience relative harmony in my relationships, or maybe people generally think well of me, and this type of thing. Or maybe it's harming me in the sense that, oh, maybe I get taken advantage of if I don't have boundaries on it, or I might be looked at a certain way as not, like, let's say, deserving of respect because I'm not respecting myself enough. So there's a variety of different things that can come up. And of course, it's going to depend on the degree to which you're doing that protection mechanism. Um, Also, what is this aspect trying to prevent? So if I think about people pleasing, it's like I'm trying to prevent relationship disrepair. I'm trying to prevent being judged and looked down on. And what is this aspect's benevolent intention? So all of your protector aspects and all of your shadow aspects in general have a benevolent intention for you. So what is the way that this aspect is trying to serve you? So in this case, if I look at people pleasing, it's trying to serve me by trying to keep my relationships going well and to have a positive self-image of goodness and this type of thing. So what would be this aspect's biggest fear? So thinking about the people-pleasing aspect, it's sort of like the biggest fear would be being rejected and being seen as a bad person. And so I know that for me, when I had a bigger problem with people pleasing before, it was like, oh gosh, if I'm not exactly this way, and if I'm not like super nice and I'm not always pleasing people, then I'm going to be revealed as this bad person, right? So that would be the big fear. Um, and what would need to be resolved to make this aspect's job obsolete? So when we think about protector aspects, they have a certain job that they're doing, and we can't just take them off of that job without having certain consequences. What we have to do is we have to resolve the roots of the shadow first. And what happens is then that aspect no longer needs to do those things. So what I would say is whenever you see a protector aspect doing a particular job for you, it's probably serving you in certain ways. And so what you want to do with that is you want to be able to say, okay, I see this symptom here, but what's at the root? So for example, if I have like a judging aspect, and I'm like, oh, I don't want to be judging people, and I don't think it's a good thing to judge people. Well, I want to look at that as a symptom that has a deeper root. And so I don't want to start messing with my tendencies toward judgment. I want to notice that it's there, but I want to say, okay, well, what are the vulnerabilities that this judgment is coming up out of? And I want to deal with the root directly as opposed to messing with the symptom. So basically, what would need to be resolved in the roots of the issue to make this aspect's job obsolete? So if I look at my people pleasing aspect, ultimately, what I would have to resolve would be I have to feel like I'm lovable, even if other people are disapproving of me. If I feel like I'm lovable and that I can love myself, even when other people are disapproving of me, then what's going to happen then is that I won't need that protector aspect as much. And so as it's needed less, it'll kind of fall back into its natural alignment. And you'll have the ability to do that, but it just won't be such a strong need to engage that protection mechanism. Which vulnerable aspect is it trying to protect? Let's see. So for me, this protector aspect, trying to protect the part of me that feels shame and that feels rejected. And so ultimately, we look at the vulnerable aspect as being the shame aspect or the rejected aspect. Does this aspect resemble behaviors of anyone in your life? I guess if I look at my life, my dad, he's kind of a people pleaser type too. So I think I really like looked up to my dad, and I probably just took that right out of his playbook. So when it comes to your vulnerable aspects and when it comes to your protector aspects, you can look and see if there's anybody in your life that it seems to resemble, that you're kind of taking the script from. So what does this aspect not want you to know about or face with? It definitely doesn't want me to face with feelings of shame and rejection. And why would it be so bad to experience what the protector aspect is trying to protect you from? Basically, it's the sense, for me, it was the sense that if I'm shameful and rejected, then I don't belong here. Like it's like I'm a mistake in the universe kind of thing. So basically, these would be some questions to ask your protector aspect. And then we have, go ahead and can I get the person who's sharing to go to the next slide? Okay. And so here are some questions to ask the vulnerable aspects. Now, remember, these are the sort of exiles. These are the ones that are directly experiencing the negative emotions and the traumas and the unmet needs. So basically, you might ask, how old is this aspect? So again, aspects that are, pushed into the shadow, that are exiles, stay stuck in that state of arrested development. So does this aspect feel like it's 3 years old? Does it feel like it's 7 years old? Does it feel like it's 20 years old? Basically, we can have shadow aspects repressed at any given point in time. Oftentimes they're repressed in childhood and teenhood because those are the more vulnerable stages of life, but it can happen really at any point in time that we experience trauma or upheaval or unmet needs. So basically, how old is this aspect? And what is it feeling right now? So what emotions is it generally dealing with? And this might be a little bit difficult to get in touch with because it's often our vulnerable aspects that are pushed the furthest down into the shadow, the furthest away from us. So it might not be something that's so clear. So for example, if we experience anger, ultimately the feeling state that's underneath anger is going to be powerlessness, but it might be really, really difficult for us to face with those feelings of powerlessness. So we want to go gradually with this. But to the extent that we can experience that, we want to be able to kind of ask that question. And again, this is all third person perspective, kind of noticing things about the vulnerable aspect, as opposed to stepping in, having emotional proximity and like sort of reintegrating with it. So that's a little bit of a different story. So right now we're just kind of getting more information about it. So why was it cast into the shadow? And so these might be things where you're not 100% sure, but if any intuitive insight comes up, go ahead and write it down and kind of like just trust what your psyche is giving you, its information. Also ask it, does it have any unmet needs? Does it need something externally? Does it need something internally? So unmet needs could be something like, oh, I need more connection with other people in my life. Or unmet needs might be, I need to be allowed to receive validation. And so I need you to like unblock the ability to receive validation. Which protection mechanisms has it generated? So protector aspects that are protecting this part. Usually it's the case, and I saw somebody ask this earlier during the break, is that when we have our vulnerable shadow aspects, there's usually fewer of the vulnerable aspects compared to the protector aspects. Usually it's like a handful of vulnerable aspects, and then it's like a bunch of different protector aspects that are protecting them. So we want to kind of question for each vulnerable aspect, what protection mechanisms it's generated. And also you want to ask, how does it feel about the way that you treat it? Does it feel like you're present with it? Does it feel like you abandon it? Does it feel like you validate it or invalidate it? So that's an important thing. So it's like kind of questioning what's the relationship between the conscious personality and the vulnerable aspect. Which moment is it stuck in? So vulnerable aspects, especially ones that are experiencing trauma or have experienced trauma, are kind of stuck in a moment. So basically I remember there was this one vulnerable aspect that I got in touch with like about 3 years ago, and I had this memory of like basically, and wasn't a repressed memory or anything. I knew it, but I was like back in the memory of like I got in trouble for something and I like got closed behind my bedroom door and put in my room. And I remember I was just standing there at the doorway screaming, and it was a really, really intense emotion, like probably one of the most intense emotions that I've ever felt. And so what I had to realize is that there was this aspect of me that was still kind of stuck in that moment. And I think the way that I had interpreted is like, oh no, my parents don't love me anymore. I've been shut out. I've been cast out. And so basically it's like there, and I had mentioned this in one of my more recent videos where it was like, please love me, please love me, please love me, please love me. And it was something I couldn't really communicate at the time because I was very little. So basically like that moment, you can kind of, as you start to get into the firsthand perspective of these aspects, which again can be a bit intense, so I recommend going slowly with that, you can kind of get a sense for what moment it's actually stuck in. What does it need me to do? So questioning, does it need anything from you? Does it need you to be more present with it? Does it need you to make more friends? Does it have unmet needs you're not catering to? What does it fear the most? So basically, let's say if we think about this aspect of mine that was closed behind the door, it fears exile. It fears being cast out, not belonging, not being loved. What are the ways this aspect is impacting your life? I suppose with that aspect, it's kind of seeing that, oh, it's bringing me back through the same pattern of like fear of abandonment and that type of thing. When does this aspect get triggered to the surface? I suppose with this aspect, it's sort of like whenever I feel powerless to get someone to listen, like that would tend to come up, or powerless to get someone to understand me. And then what makes this aspect difficult to be present with? Well, it's like the intense emotions. So it's like this intense panic, shame kind of feeling. It's like a mixture of those things. So basically, these would be some questions to ask vulnerable aspects here. And so basically, we have these two different sheets where you can kind of look and see what questions you can ask your vulnerable aspects. So let's go ahead and we'll take about, I guess, 5 minutes, and I would pick out one of your 10 aspects and start going through, like, first off, the laddering, so kind of get the sense of like, if you wanted to pick out a protector aspect, you can be like, oh, why are you doing this protection mechanism? And then start exploring it through the laddering process. Or if you have a more vulnerable aspect, it's like, it's like, oh, what are you feeling? Why do you feel that way? And like kind of laddering down that way. And then you can also ask these questions on these last couple of slides here. Okay. And then, yeah, we'll talk about that in about 5 minutes. All right, just a little bit of time left, and then I'll have people share their responses. Yeah, I'll have people share their responses in the chat box there to see if, like, did anything come up for you guys that, stood out to you as something you didn't know before, something that like you maybe had never considered quite about, like, the aspects and like, what's motivating their behaviors and that sort of thing. Gotcha. Yeah, protector aspect, blending in, not accepting its own talents and achievements. Yeah, so that's interesting. So it's kind of like recognizing those two things as part of the same protection mechanism. Okay, feeling unworthy and vulnerable aspect fears the most loneliness. But at the same time, I feel like the loneliness is to avoid feeling rejected. Okay, so that's interesting. Yeah, so basically we have an aspect that has a couple of different lines of defense there. So it's sort of like you have the aspect that feels unworthy. So it's kind of like a shame. And then underneath that, the shame comes from loneliness, and the loneliness comes from feelings of rejection. Yeah, so interesting. All right. I tried laddering, but can't find the vulnerable aspect causing it. Gotcha. Ahmed, what would be the vulnerable aspect that you're spotting out that you're not sure what would be actually the protection mechanism that relates to the vulnerable aspect that you're kind of seeking for? The overburdened aspect is the responsibility averse aspect. Yeah, so the responsibility averse aspect is that protector aspect for that. Um, Gotcha. So yeah, Michael said he represses more of his feminine aspects because they're still seen as shameful by a fair portion of society. Yeah, so oftentimes like expectations of gender and things like that can create a situation where we go, oh, let's push that one away, and I want to only be these qualities over here. So that's a common one. Um, Somewhere lack of trust in my self-discipline, knowledge, and self-confidence, trying to protect the shame aspect. Yeah, so basically, like, if there's sort of like the inability to trust yourself to bring things forward, it could be, I guess it could be kind of like self-sabotage. Like, so you don't trust yourself because there's self-sabotage, and there's self-sabotage because if you sabotage yourself, you don't have to put yourself out there and experience the shame of that. That's a possibility. Yeah, people pleasing and blending in. Yeah, so it's trying to make sure that you're maybe very palatable and don't stand out too much, maybe for fear of getting certain types of attention, possibly. Um, okay. Literally all the protector aspects are covering for feeling powerless. Absolutely, yeah. So sometimes it can be the case where we have one vulnerable aspect that like all of our protection mechanisms are coming off of. Um, I tried laddering, with trying to figure out why I get jealous of my spouse, but can't figure it out. My childhood was rough. What might be happening there is you might have somewhat of an anxious avoidant kind of situation going on underneath the surface. So if you felt like the rug was going to be pulled out from under you at any moment in time in childhood, it could be a childhood aspect playing back through that same thing over again. Or if there were times where your trust was betrayed in childhood, or things like that, or if you had experienced that before, that could also create some trauma in the same pattern there. um, yeah, so okay, so I got an answer from Ahmed, the addicted aspect. So basically, the addicted aspect would be, um, let's see, that would be the vulnerable. No, the addicted aspect would be the protector aspect, and then underneath that is the vulnerable aspect. So basically, what I would ask, and I think it's a good question just in general, is like, what is it that you're trying to move away from through engaging in the addiction? All right. Okay, and I'll go ahead and I'll get one more. Okay. Okay, let's see. Gotcha. So we got one. So if you want to abandon me, I'll abandon you first. Yeah, so and stonewalling. Yeah, so it's basically, it's sort of like it's with that tendency, it's like, imagine that you got the rug pulled out from you so many times. It's like, okay, if you're going to pull the rug out from under me, I'm just going to leave. I'm not going to let you pull the rug out from under me. So it's like avoiding the pain and feeling more in control. So as opposed to something happening to you, it's like, even though the same thing is happening, you are doing it to yourself. And so I would think that that's probably a protection mechanism in on top of powerlessness. And also maybe powerlessness and rejection, so it's probably a mixture of those two things. Okay. All righty. Okay, thank you all for sharing. All right, so let me see what's the next thing on the agenda. Okay, so asking the questions. And yeah, so what I would say with these exercises that we've done today, you can of course take any of the information, you can pinpoint out more shadow aspects, and if you noticed any others on the list that you could, that you maybe didn't explore before, you could do that. And then you can also just, with any given aspect, you can start to explore them using these questions, and also like using that laddering method. Another one that might be quite helpful, and I don't have this in the PowerPoint, is to ask, like, how does it feel and what does it mean? So it's sort of like, let's say you have an aspect that, let's go back to the people pleasing. So basically, if you wanted to look at the people pleasing aspect, it's like, well, okay, so when I'm people pleasing, how does it feel, right? So how does it feel? It's like, oh, I kind of feel maybe I'm self-betraying myself. I don't feel comfortable with it, or maybe it's my comfort zone. So that would be how it feels. And then you can also ask, like, what does it mean? What does it mean to me to be a people pleaser? It's like, oh, it means I'm looked upon well, and like basically like looking at all of the meanings that you would make out of being a people pleaser and what it means to be the opposite of that. So those can be also some questions to ask as well. Yeah, so basically, yeah, so these are the exercises. Now, one of the things that I wanted to just spend a few minutes talking about, really just a couple, and then we can get some Q&A, is if I could get the person who's doing the PowerPoint to go to the slide with the shadow work group class. Yeah, so I just wanted to give a heads up that starting on October 13th and going on for 13 weeks past that, well, actually 14, because I'll be skipping a week due to the Thanksgiving holiday. Basically, I'll be having a shadow work group class. I do this class a few times a year, and my class size limit is 12. Enrollment closes on Monday, October 11th. And after the workshop, I'll send you guys a discount code in case anybody wants to join up on the group class. Yeah, so go ahead and you can switch to the next slide over. Okay, so the Q&A. Yeah, so basically what you can do is you can write any questions that you have in the chat, and I'll go through and I'll look at which ones that I think will be the most valuable to answer. And we'll kind of spend about 30 minutes or so, just going through some questions. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and anybody who has any questions about anything about the shadow or anything that we went over today. Oh, yes, and thank you also, is it Alagika? Alagika? I'm not sure, but thank you so much for sharing the screen. Mhm. Awesome, awesome. Okay. All right, so I have a question. Would you say it's possible to carry shadows from past lives in the present life? How can we recognize past life shadows and integrate them? Now, this is something I'm not sure of. I like to remain a fence sitter when it comes to questions like this until I experience definitively something like that. I suppose what I would say is that I don't know, but I'm open-minded to it. Okay. How does the shadow present itself in dreams, and how can we work with it like that? Yeah, so that's a great question. So basically, you can also name shadow aspects for dream characters that you feel represent them. So for example, like let's say that I had the pink Power Ranger show up in my dream, and because of the context of the dream and because of the meaning that I gleaned from it, I thought, oh, I bet this is a representation of a shadow aspect of mine from when I was 5 and I really liked Power Rangers, right? So what I could do is I could even label out that aspect as pink Power Ranger Emerald, and I can start to do that same questioning process with it. Yeah, so that's a great question. Okay, what aspect do you think is related to not taking control over my financial situation? So there can be a variety of different reasons as to why that would be. So basically one example among many could be like, oh, because my financial aspect isn't taken care of and I don't have financial freedom, now I'm having to live with roommates and I'm having to go to the laundromat where there's a bunch of other people and I'm having to carpool to work. And so this is giving me some kind of social need that I'm not meeting otherwise. And so when I want to make my financial situation better, maybe this other aspect from the shadow tries to sabotage it, because it's like, hey, the only reason why I'm getting my social needs met is because we don't have as much money as we would like. So that would be like one example. Another example could be resistance to receiving. And oftentimes this can have to do with that that starving for love aspect, because oftentimes love can be interpreted as resources and money and things like that. So if we feel like we don't deserve love, we might put ourselves in positions where we feel like we don't deserve financial abundance and things like that. Or we might just have a difficult time with receiving. Or, it could also be related to scarcity, So basically, having experienced tough times in my life myself, I know that in the toughest financial times for me, those are the times where it's like sort of your psychology is about like, well, use all of your resources that you have. Like it's not the time for saving. It's sort of like when you're in survival mode, it's like, okay, I have only this much resources, and so I have to use every drop of it. And so potentially it could be some kind of feeling of scarcity that's making it to where you are sort of maybe not saving or, utilize, basically using money in certain ways that are not helpful. So that's a possibility as well. So it could be a scarcity aspect, but really with that, there could be a variety of different aspects. So those are just like 3 examples among many. Okay. Okay. All right. Hey, Emerald, my shadow aspects seem to be very shallow and typical, and I feel I stick with them by means of conscious self-indulgences and addictions. I feel like I will lose all fun and also afraid of the possibility that maybe I still not manage it after all. So what I would say is I would just look through that and I would kind of look for, any protection mechanisms that might be in that or any vulnerable aspects. So basically, when it comes to, let's say, the sense that the shadow aspects are kind of shallow and typical, I would wonder, like, if you do have an aspect that's, let's say, more typical, why would that be so bad? And kind of ladder down and sort of like ask that question, because I'm getting the sense that there's sort of an element of self-judgment in there. So you want to work first with the resistances. And so if you have self-judgment, I might write down a self-judging aspect and explore that. Or, I might even ask, like, why would it be so bad? Why would it be so bad if my shadow aspects are shallow and typical? Let's see. So, and self-indulgences and addictions oftentimes are to get away from other feelings that we don't want to face with. And so basically being able to exercise self-compassion is also really important in these instances. So one of the things, and this is something that I probably should have put in the PowerPoint overall, is shadow work is fundamentally self-love practice. So what we want to be doing is, like, if we're coming at shadow work from the perspective of, oh no, I need to fix myself, then we are communicating an unloving perspective. So what we want to do is we want to get into a space where our goal is to love and accept all of these aspects. And so even the aspects that's judgmental, even the aspects that has difficulty being the loving aspect. So basically, if you notice that there's a part of you that, like, it's like basically self-judging, instead of trying to judge that away as bad, go, okay, hang on a second, I'm judging myself. Why am I judging myself? Or it's like, if there's a part that's like resistant to accepting these aspects, it's like, okay, why is this aspect resistant to accepting these aspects? Let's see. Gotcha. Yes. And so Charlene said, do we create shadow aspects all of our life? So basically, yeah, at any point in time, when we actually split off aspects from ourselves, which can be any moment in time, really, we can have shadow aspects. Now, most of our shadow aspects are probably going to be rooted in our childhood, especially our vulnerable aspects. But if we experience, some kind of like difficult situation or trauma that we're not able to cope with, that can certainly create shadow. So shadow, the reason why aspects end up in the shadow are for four main reasons. So one reason is because we made a decision about our identity and we said, I'm like this and I'm not like that. Or we made a decision about the worldview and we said the world's like this and the world's not like that. And I have to be this way if I'm going to conform to that. So that's very, even the worldview is very much linked back to the identity. And then we also have the traumas and unmet needs. So traumas being experiencing an emotional experience that's too intense for the nervous system to process it all at once. And so we basically fragment. We fragment off the aspect of ourself, and we also shut down the emotions that that aspect is feeling. And then we also have unmet aspects with unmet needs. So those aspects with unmet needs, those aspects are kind of, I guess the way that I think about them is like they're kind of like wandering through the desert and they just can't, like, basically all they can focus on is like, I need to get this need met. I need to get this need met. And so it would be a little bit like, if you could imagine, you could wander around in a desert for decades without dying and without water, but you're just so desperate for the water. This is how some unmet needs based aspects that get pushed into the shadow are like, which is why, because of the intense emotion, they get pushed into the shadow. So yeah, so anytime that one of those four things or multiple of those four things happen, that's when aspects go in the shadow. Most of that happens in childhood, but we can still have it in adulthood as well. Okay. Is there a way one can enhance shadow work with breath work pattern or listening to specific audio? Now, I'm not sure about audio. Insofar as it's going to help you focus toward the sensations in the body, I would say yes. But breath work, definitely. I know that I've done some of the Wim Hof method. That one's a really good one. But basically anything that's going to essentially get you to tap into what's going on in the body on a somatic level, because it's very physical. When we're talking about trauma, it's a very physical thing. So again, we have the nervous system, and basically a trauma is when that happens, it's an emotion, which of course emotions come through the nervous system as electrical impulses. It's basically too much electricity for the nervous system to handle at one go. And so what happens is that parasympathetic response happens, those emotions get shut down. And so things like breath work, things like meditation can help us, like, little by little go back into those emotions that are stored in the body on a very physical level. Yeah, so What are some good questions to ask characters in your dreams? So one of the things, just kind of like a good stock question to ask is like, what are you meant to represent to me? Like, what do I need to learn from you? That type of thing. Gotcha. So, so I have a question. Shadow is the same part in dissociative identity disorder. That's something I couldn't necessarily speak to because I'm not 100% sure. All I know is that it seems like there's a lot of similarities there because ultimately we're dealing fundamentally with a fragmentation. I guess the way that I think about it, and take this with a grain of salt because I'm no expert in dissociative identity disorder, is that basically if we think about the shadow, we have one ego and then we kind of split off certain fragments of ourselves from it. The way that I understand DID is that you kind of have separate ego structures. And when one ego structure is above the surface, the other one's below. So it's basically just like instead of having one consolidated identity with fragments coming off of it, it's like you have like multiple split off identities. That's the way I understand it. Again, take that with a grain of salt because I'm not 100% sure, but I've thought about this before. Oh, good question. How much is a healthy amount of shadow work? What I would say is that there are probably times where there's more of a need to be focused on the shadow. So for example, if you're in the process of going through a really difficult time and it's a dark night of the soul and stuff is coming up to the surface, you might spend a bit more time with it. And ultimately you want to be intuitive about that. But on just a normal day-to-day basis, and you want to mostly be in this kind of like, basically more focused toward the external, more focused toward, engaging in life and that type of thing. You want to be very moderate about it. And so what I would say, and my shadow work practice, I don't have a specific time that I sit down and do it. It's kind of, I just have a general sense of like, I'm paying attention to what's going on with myself throughout the day. So it's really hard for me to give a quantified amount. But what I would say is I like the analogy of you're a mechanic that also drives. So when you're doing the shadow work, you're underneath the hood, you're the mechanic. And that's an important part of it. It's an important part of car maintenance. But if you're only ever working under the hood and you're never driving the car, that's when that becomes a problem. So you want to make sure that you're focusing mostly on integrating these aspects so that you can incorporate these elements into your life. So if you find yourself being too internal, that would be something that I would say some external work might be more necessary there. Okay, where is the difference between the personal and collective shadow? Is this a real thing? And is it helpful to distinguish in shadow work? Yeah, so basically when it comes to the collective shadow, so let me make a distinction here. So basically you have Jung's theory of the collective unconscious. And so the collective unconscious is sort of home to the archetypes, the archetypes being kind of like basically part of the anatomy of the psyche, where everybody's going to have essentially the same archetypes that will be fleshed out different ways based off of their culture, their era, and the individual experiences of their life. So for example, everyone's going to have the queen archetype, and everyone's going to have the father archetype, and everyone's going to have the artist archetype, and everyone's going to have all of these different archetypal forms as a kind of like raw skeleton of meaning. But it might come through in a different way depending on the circumstances of their life. Now, when it comes to collective shadow, the way that I think of the collective shadow, I can think about it in terms of the collective unconscious and the archetypes and things like that. I often think about the collective shadow as being almost a conglomeration of everyone's individual shadow. So for example, if an entire society is dealing with the same kind of trauma, so let's say that a society is impacted by a famine. What we have is we have a kind of collective shadow that's rising up in that particular community around scarcity, right? So we have certain traumas that are coming up and that might even come through, let's say, in generations to come. So even when that famine is resolved, and let's say we have generations on down the line, like 3 generations down, the children that are in that third generation might be like, oh, for some reason, I just feel like there's not enough love to go around, or some reason I feel like there's just not enough, or they might have certain coping mechanisms that they've taken on as a result of, let's say, being around their parents who are around their grandparents who kind of internalize certain protection mechanisms and coping mechanisms for experiences they didn't personally have. So when I think about collective shadow in that sense, I think about it as like, in circumstances where a society is dealing with a collective trauma, we'll have a collective shadow arise from that. So I can think about that in both of those directions. Um, and is it helpful to distinguish in shadow work? What I would say is that collective shadow, in terms of the collective trauma, it can be quite helpful to find out that, oh, actually, this is a generational trauma that my mom was going through and her mom was going through, and so on and so on and so on. That can be helpful because you can start to track it back a little bit. Now, when it comes to the collective unconscious and the archetypes of the collective unconscious, this can be quite helpful as well, because sometimes with our protection mechanisms, we can sort of grab a hold of certain archetypes and we can become too polarized to those archetypes. Like, so for example, when I was a teenager, when I first started to integrate the warrior archetype, it was really helping me out a lot because I had a lot of need for it, because I had a lot of vulnerabilities. I became too polarized into the warrior, and I became too, everything became about work and everything became about the goal, and I really ended up burning myself out. So yeah, it's a very important topic for sure. Okay, let's see. All right, can you tell us a little more about self-sabotage mechanism as a protector aspect? Yeah, so self-sabotage can come up for a variety of different reasons. Now, one thing to always recall with shadow aspects is that if you have a protector aspect or a vulnerable aspect, they're always trying to do things in your self-interest because they are you. So if it's self-sabotaging, it's not sabotaging just for the sake of sabotaging you. It's trying to serve some other goal by doing so. So you kind of have to ask, what is the benevolent intention behind the self-sabotage to really get to the bottom of it? So for example, if I fear failure, I might self-sabotage myself so that I never give my full effort. And if I never give my full effort, maybe I don't, maybe I have this fear that, oh, my full effort won't be enough. And so I self-sabotage so that I go, oh, well, it's just because I didn't try hard enough and not because I couldn't do it. So that's a common one. Another reason for self-sabotage is because part of us wants to achieve this goal. The other part feels like it's not going to have its needs met if that goal is achieved. And yet another reason for self-sabotage is if the conscious personality doesn't really want that, or the conscious personality wants that, but we don't really want it in our heart of hearts. So it could be like, let's say we were raised in a family that expected us to go into the family business, and like that was just an expectation. And let's say that was my situation, and I built my whole identity and my thoughts of my future on, okay, I'm going to become the next person in the family business. But underneath it, I didn't really have a deep intrinsic motivation toward that. And so whenever I'm going to try to fill the shoes of my family and to try to keep that business going, well, what I'm going to find is maybe I'm going to be sabotaging because part of me really doesn't want it, but maybe I'm not conscious of the part of me that doesn't want it. So that would be another reason why. So as with many of these aspects, there can be a variety of different reasons why the same protection mechanism can come up. So that's why it's important to ask like those laddering questions. But I would say specifically with self-sabotage, one of the most important questions to ask, if not the most important question to ask, is what's the benevolent motivation behind the sabotage? Okay. Gotcha. Thinking of the cultural phenomenon of toxic masculinity, is that a form of shadow? Is it a protective or vulnerable, or both? Yeah, so basically, if I think about what toxic masculinity is, I think about it as being someone who's kind of callous to their emotions and this type of thing, and might behave in kind of an aggressive way. And so that's what I'm thinking about when like that term comes up. So those things would definitely be like protector aspects. So in relation to this, let me think about, like, let's say a more concrete example. So let's say that there is a little boy, and he's going to school, like let's say he's in middle school. Let's say that's a middle school boy, and maybe he shows some kind of sensitivity or something of that nature, and he gets bullied by the other little boys in the class, and maybe they bully him, maybe they beat him up or something like that. And so what he decides to do, consciously or unconsciously, is he basically puts on a more of like a tough kind of guy persona, and he like tries to be very, very tough, and he tries to kind of behave like the bully guys in order to protect his own vulnerability. And so basically, in that sense, it would be a protector aspect. It would also be an aspect that represses and pushes down his more vulnerable aspect, because ultimately it's a protection mechanism to avoid that uncomfortable feeling underneath. And so basically, I would say that that could be an example of, let's say, that behavior coming up where, let's say somebody becomes very callous or very aggressive in order to protect their own vulnerabilities, or so that nobody messes with them. Yeah, so after integrating my shadow, I realized I spent most of my time under the shadow aspect, how to stop it. Gotcha. Yeah. So whenever we haven't worked through a shadow aspect completely, it can have basically a huge spectrum of control over us. So if we're not aware of it altogether, oftentimes we'll be very controlled by it. So basically, the more conscious you can become of it, the more you can get free of its agendas and things like that. Okay. Okay. All right. Any comment on the golden shadow? So the way I'm thinking about the golden shadow is basically the positive elements within the shadow. And what I would say about the positive elements in the shadow is that every single shadow aspect that you have is going to have the golden shadow, because these are, fundamentally, there's nothing inherently shadowy about shadow aspects. It's just that they've been pushed into this space within the psyche. So it's a little bit like if I have a dark closet and I put this pencil in the closet, the pencil is going to be shrouded in shadow. But if I bring it out into the sunlight, then it's going to be in light. And so there's nothing fundamentally shadowy about the aspects that get relegated to the shadow. And so these aspects oftentimes are expressing in negative ways. Number one, because they're in the shadow and they have to manipulate to get their needs met, but also because they're often dealing with unmet needs in general, or shame, or trauma, all of these different things, which can create a variety of different coping mechanisms. Now, add to that these aspects are stuck in a state of arrested development, where, let's say, a given aspect might stay at age 3, so those coping mechanisms might not be the most sophisticated. They might really be quite destructive. And so in a sense, we could look at this aspect and we can go, oh man, this aspect is really awful. There's nothing redeeming about this aspect because it's wreaking so much havoc in my life. But ultimately, all of our aspects have positive qualities. They're all just part of ourselves. So in the same way that every individual has positive qualities in them, these aspects all have those positive qualities. The main thing is that we have to resolve the trauma, the unmet needs, the reason why they're in the shadows, so that we can actually have their more positive aspects individuate and bloom forward into the personality. So I would say the concept of the golden shadow, I would say that all of these aspects have their own kind of gold. Let's see. Once we've realized something, how do we keep up positive progress on it? So one of the things that's interesting about shadow work is that a lot of times if you strike gold, in a sense, you don't have to do it again. So if you come up against a huge realization, what's known can't be unknown. Now, when it comes to the progress element of shadow work, I would say that's when you kind of get into the somatic work element of things, which tends to be the thing that takes the longest to do. So basically trauma, when we're dealing with that, it's a really intense negative emotion, and it's stored in the body. And so every time we go to sit with it, it may be uncomfortable, but every time we sit with it, it's kind of a little bit like taking a lick off of a lollipop. So if the hard candy shell of the lollipop is representative of our trauma, and every time we sit with it, we take one small layer off it. That's basically what we can think of when it comes to working with these shadow aspects. And that does require quite a lot of time and progress, but really it's just starting the habit of sitting with it for a few minutes here and a few minutes there. So it's like a journey of many little steps. But when it comes to big realizations, so for example, when I had the realization that I had this aspect that was always saying, please love me, please love me, please love me. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. So some things, once you get there, once you have that shift and that realization, it's like you can't go back unconscious to it. Yeah, so okay. Seems like we should live thinking, feeling, and resolve. Okay. Yeah, seems like we should live thinking, feeling, and resolving shadows every day. What do you think about this idea? So let me actually, with this, let me give a different framework than I think how most people think about shadow work. So basically, I think a lot of people tend to think about shadow work as like, okay, I have these aspects, they're down in a hole, and I need to get them from out of the hole up to normalcy, right? So that's kind of like that point A to point B kind of way to look at the shadow. Now, when I think about shadow work, like I said, I think about it more as like a general self-love practice, and I think having this more zoomed out perspective on it is helpful because ultimately we want to be accepting all of our aspects exactly how they are and where they are, because shadow work is, again, fundamentally a self-love practice. And so I like to think about shadow work as this constant dance that's always going on between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. And so basically, if we could think about the conscious mind as being sort of the receiver of the unconscious mind's wisdom, it's like the best thing that we can do is to stay tuned into ourselves. Now, when it comes to heavy duty, we're dredging up like the really uncomfortable stuff. Those might come, basically there's a kind of cycle. So what I notice is like, I find that I go through seasons where, and I don't mean seasons in the term, in terms of it lasts a whole year, but it's like maybe certain parts of a given point in time, let's say during a given 2 week period of time, it's like maybe a few days of those I'll really feel like, oh, I need to be more with these parts of myself and I have to tune in and pay attention. And then at other points I'm like more outwardly focused and I'm integrating the things that I've experienced. And so what I would say is to be more intuitive about it. So it's not something you want to be like, okay, every day I'm going to do my 20 minutes of shadow work. I think about it as more of like an intuitive dance that the conscious and the unconscious mind will always be kind of doing. But sometimes the conscious mind has to turn itself outward and sometimes inward. So I think thinking about it that way might be a more helpful paradigm. All right, and I'll go ahead and I will get two more questions here. Okay, what about low tolerance to frustration? What protection mechanism would that be? So I hate losing in games and I'd rather quit than continue playing. It's a very physical feeling, like heartbeats. So I'm thinking this is a possible trigger. So basically a trigger is something that brings up a trauma from the past, or maybe even an unmet need, like an aspect that has an unmet need. It doesn't necessarily have to do with the moment itself, but the moment itself is similar enough that it sort of pulls that stuff back up from the unconscious. So basically, if frustration itself and experiencing because frustration and any form of anger, it always comes from some kind of powerlessness. And so basically, if there's low tolerance to frustration, it could be that there's a deeper shadow aspect that has a feeling of powerlessness that's more intense than that. And whenever these mild frustrations come up, that's just close enough to the feeling of powerlessness to be a trigger to that deeper feeling of powerlessness. So I would say I would recommend looking around for a vulnerable aspect that relates to powerlessness in that case. Okay. All right, and I'll get one more. Okay. All right. I decided last week that I was making myself a project, meaning what are my strengths and what are my weaknesses, all good. Okay, hang on one second. All right, hang on. Let's see, let me find one that's really okay. How can these tools be used with people who think they don't need or want help? What I would say with that is ultimately, and probably a bit of a frustrating answer, but ultimately, if people are in a space where they're not really receptive to it, then you might not be able to get very far with them. I think like one of the things that I've noticed in myself as somebody who's interested in things like shadow work and kind of like, exploring deeply into things, and sometimes that experience can be a little bit isolating because most people don't really have this tendency quite as much. And so I know that there have been times where and actually clients that I've worked with have kind of reported the same things, kind of want other people to like sort of be on a similar path to them. It's like, oh, if I could only just show my parent like shadow work, and like it's like they're gonna get it and they're gonna be able to work through things. Or oh, if I can only like just bring, my friend into like this shadow work thing, and we could have great conversations about that. And so I think, there's a desire to connect with other people, on these bases, and to be able to have these types of discussions, and that type of thing. And so if that motivation comes anywhere from that, then what I would say is just to like, you might have to temper your expectations, and to understand that some people will be into it and some people won't be. But I guess if you are really feeling like someone is in need of help, um, I guess the best thing I could recommend is to kind of just be present with that person, and you might potentially just weave in some of the questions here as well, but you might not get that person on board with actually doing that if that's not really part of their life path, and that type of thing. Mhm. Alrighty. Okay. All right. So that brings us to the end here of the workshop. Thank you all for bearing with me with the technical difficulties. And thank you so much.